Hello, everyone. Welcome to this evening's ADN review, critical responses and discussion, which is our second in our three-part online session. Very quickly, I'm going to introduce myself. My name is Hao Nguyen. I'm a founding director of the Asian Dramaturgs Network, ADN, together with my co-directors, Charlene Rajendran, who's with us today, and Robin Leun from Center 42. The Asian Dramaturgs Network, or ADN, is formed with the intent of mapping and networking the region's dramaturgical experience and knowledge. It is a collaboratively conceptualized with Center 42 and held its inaugural in Singapore in 2016. Since then, I'm very happy to report that various gatherings of dramaturgs, performance makers, arts educators from around the Asia Pacific region have taken place in various places from Japan to Australia. And Center 42, we're very happy to also say that Center 42 is the principal organizing partner for ADN. For this evening, thank you for being with us. It's a very special session where we have three very illustrious speakers and a very illustrious moderator who will help us take us through what their thoughts are about ADN Review E-zine that we've just put out. I'm just going to quickly give an introduction to the speakers. There is Gee Imaan Semmalar, Janice Poon, and Helly Minarti. Gee Imaan, if you could just wave to indicate to everyone. Great. Gee is an activist, a writer, theater artist, and filmmaker, and explores identity, history, citizenship, caste, and political action through his art. He co-founded Panmai Theatre Group along with Living Smile Video and Angel Gladdy in 2014. And the debut of the production of Panmai Theatre, it was Color of Trance 2.0, which was devised by the founders based on their own lives as trans people and has toured many cities of North America and India. Gee also directed one of the first films on trans men in South India called, let me get this right, Kalvatukal or Sculptures in 2012. And in 2016, Gee acted in a road trip experimental film called Naked Wheels, which covered the issues of trans people. That's Gee. And we have Janice Poon. Say hi, Janice.
Hello.
Wave.
Hello.
Janice is a senior lecturer for playwriting and dramaturgy and academic project officer at the School of Drama at the Hong Kong Academy for Performing Arts. She is also the artistic director of Hong Kong Dramatists and a veteran theatre artist and cultural practitioner who engage with playwriting, directing, dramaturgy, curating, and theatre making with specific focus on contemporary dramatic text and dramaturgy in cross-disciplinary and cross-cultural theatre making. Her works have been presented in the UK, Europe, the US, Canada, China, Taiwan, and Singapore. Her curated project called Dramaturgy and Beyond Dance Dramaturgy Series was nominated for an Outstanding Service Award at the Hong Kong Dance Award in 2019. And last but not least, we have Helly Minarti. Say hi, Helly. Who lives in Yogyakarta,
Hello.
who is an independent scholar and curator with a focus on performance and rethinking radical strategies to connect practice and theory. Helly's main interest is historiographies of choreography as discursive practice vis-a-vis the eclectic knowledge that infuses the intricate understanding of human body and nature. She has been engaged in various curatorial projects in Indonesia and overseas, and the most recent was Jejak Tabi Exchange, Wandering Asian Contemporary Performance from 2018 to 2021. Helly earned her PhD in dance studies from University of Roehampton in the UK. I'd just like to flag up also Helly, Gee, and Janice are great friends of ADN, and they, in their different capacities, have actually taken part in various events, symposiums, or even our dramaturgy lab over the last few years. So we're very happy to have them back here again. Last but not least, our moderator, Kok Heng Leun. He is a prominent figure. Please say hi, Heng Leun. Is a prominent figure in the Singapore art scene. And we're very, very happy to have him with us. He's built his artistic career as a theatre director, playwright, dramaturg, and of course, educator. He is known for engaging the community on various issues through the arts, championing civic discourse across different segments of society. Heng Leun's contributions to the arts have landed him awards from the Singapore National Arts Council Young Artist Award in 2000 and the Cultural Fellowship in 2014. Heng Leun has also served as a nominated Member of Parliament from 2016 to 2018 to represent the arts sector in Singapore. So without further ado, I'm going to pass this on to Heng Leun, who will be telling you how we are running today's show and how you, the audience, can also get involved with the discussion. Heng Leun, take it away.
Thank you, Hao Nian. You sound really very soothing. Huh?
Thank you.
Hi, good evening or good afternoon to everyone wherever you are. Thanks for joining us in this online discussion. The topic of today's online discussion is very much first centered on the ADN review, which is, if you could see the link on the chat box, this is actually a series of 3 E-zines that the ADN has curated. It offers the snapshots of the work of ADN, drawing from presentations and dialogues that occurred at all the various ADN events since 2016. And because all these sessions have been recorded and transcribed, so they have been then selected for a specific focus in each of the 3 volumes. And today we are looking at the volume, or the second volume, which is tracing. The focus is on tracing. Well, if you look at it, the whole E-zine is really a kind of assemblage, you know, of various ideas about the kind of thinking and talking that ADN has made happen. And it's meant to also communicate a sense of what dramaturgs in Asia have been doing and thinking. But I also think very importantly through this E-zine, they ask quite a lot of important questions that would want to chart other possibilities of how dramaturg can work and what dramaturgy means. So if you have read it, please send comments to the editorial team. They have put up a lot of effort, and the editorial teams are with us. There's Charlene, there's Guati, there's Dominic, and there's Daniel. I hope I've got all the editorial teams in there. Thanks. And at the same time, I think what they really want to do is to hear your response to today's online discussion. At the same time, we can also take this opportunity to hear some of the developments of some of the dramaturgs who are in practice, especially since, you know, over the last couple of years, we have gone through quite great changes in our environment, in our different contexts. So tonight, what we will do is really to get into this discussion. As mentioned, after my introduction, we will get into a discussion. There are 2 parts to the discussion. The first part will be asking our speakers to share their thoughts on 1 or 2 points that resonated with them when they read the ADN Review Volume 2. They will each be given about 20 minutes, and then there'll be some discussion. They'll each be given 5 minutes, and after that, there'll be discussion going on. And after that, we'll have a 10 minutes Q&A session with the audience. You can ask questions through the Zoom, or you can, that means you can use your video, or you can ask through the chat. But I think it'll be good to hear your voice in the process. After that, we'll segue into the second discussion, where the speakers will also put out maybe 1 or 2 questions or provocations about dramaturgical thinking or dramaturgy that they have been dealing in their own current practice. That will take us also over 20 minutes, and then after that, we'll open the floor to, to audience participation again. So let's hope that today the facilitator will be less present. And as you know, in a lot of dramaturgical work, the dramaturg sits there quietly watching and listening and taking notes. And you will be observing and listening, and maybe at certain time ask questions. And I think a lot of you are very interested in dramaturgical work. Maybe as audience, you also take this opportunity to practice your dramaturgical thinking and also try to ask questions of our speakers so that we all learn from each other. Okay? Okay, without further ado, I'll invite Helly to start us off with her reflection after, or things that she would want to raise after reading ADN Review Volume 2, Tracing. Helly, over to you.
Thank you for ADN team, and then congratulations to the editorial team for producing this, like Hong Yan earlier said, yeah, a very nicely designed with clearly a dramaturgical thinking behind it. For us the readers to navigate. So I have two things to respond. The first one is in my notes. I was somehow drawn to I don't know how to pronounce the name. The response of Felipe Cervera towards Janet Pillai's keynote article in that in that edition. And this is really struck me. It's really hit me because he said how we speak about dramaturgy is also dramaturgy, and I think it's it is, and he kind of like suggests that, you know, in terms of like tracing our own practices in this. The most, I think one of the most important is to understand the relational ontologies that may define what dramaturgy is at any given point. Of course, I mean, in tracing our practices, I mean, it's inevitable sometimes that we kind of like look at our own history, like the historical trajectory of dramaturgy as a practice within our own context. But it is perhaps more useful to really locate ourselves, not really being yet seduced to really look at you know, clear references, like, you know, which is like predictably like Euro-American, drawn from Euro-American practices. And the second one is Charlene's notes that a dramaturgy of life that translate into performance making. It's not separate and it's intertwined. I think in one of Joe's meeting, I think it was in Yokohama, Peter said that, you know, it's because I was very reluctant to identify myself or my practice as a dramaturg until I was engaged in this in 2016, you know, the inaugural meeting. And then so even after that, I was listening more, but not really confident or not really convinced that what I do is dramaturgy in a sense. But then again, Peter said, no, Helly, it's not. It's, you have to really step back and look at your whole practice, not only like, you know, your involvement in certain performances, but yeah. So it's really this notion of dramaturgy, not only as an approach, but in a broader sense, not only like, and that's how that performance and life, to me, is always like that, that performance and life has been always, my arts practice and my life has been always intertwined. I don't really see it as a separate things anymore, at least the last 5-7 years. So that's the two things that I can offer, that I drew from this, the whole book. Yeah, is it, I mean, I'm very conscious about my time. Is it 1 more minute? Okay. Yeah, so it's, to wrap up, I think it's very related, both of these both of these notes, because I think, of course, and the first one touched upon how we decolonize. I didn't see it in the beginning, but actually, the direction is that how we decolonize ourselves in our way of connecting our practice with this term. I think that's it first.
Okay.
Yeah.
Helly?
Thank you.
Thanks, Helly. Helly brought out the 2 points. Interestingly, as she was talking, I was just thinking, if dramaturgy and life are so interconnected, right? Then that we become so embedded, and how we talk about it is also a dramaturgy. So it actually then means that as a dramaturg, we must have some very super capacity of being highly reflective, such that we are able to step back to even critique ourselves and look at ourselves. How do we actually gain that practice? How do we ensure that we actually have the capability to step back while at the same time being so much embedded in it to be able to reflect, throughout that process? Perhaps this is a question for us to further think about, but that is what Helly made me think about, especially, when you are a dramaturg. So perhaps we should then ask the question next to Gee to actually share his thoughts about this particular review. Gee, over to you.
Thank you, ADN, for having me. It's nice to see all the faces after a long time. I'll just start with some of the things that I found was really fun about the ADN Volume 2. Of course, I mean, we always go for these, events, and people promise that they will make a document, a magazine, and it's very rarely that people actually follow through with it, especially after all these years. So a huge, huge congratulations to the editors and the team, including the invisibilized labor of people who've done the transcriptions. And, it must not have been an easy task. So thanks a lot for really putting this together. And I found that the volume is, both in terms of design, as Honyan had commented before the rest of you joined, the design is really good. And it's also fun in the sense that the editorial note, rather than being a somber, very serious tone, also has Michael Jackson songs. And the other thing that is linked to one of the comments by Heng Leun Kok was that this idea of reflexivity or being critical, particularly the portion where one of the times that I was a troublemaker and I kind of commented on there not being any queer women on the panel, it has been included in the volume. And I think that's testimony for the kind of space that ADN is, where as I have come to expect, you're not disinvited in future, but invited back to make more provocations of the team, and to actually include it in the volume is really great as well. And I liked how it was staged, or rather scripted, almost like a play, including the facial expressions of the people who were on the panel. So I really enjoyed reading that bit. In terms of responding to the volume thematically, I think, the very fact that it's called tracing, or in another sense, mapping, I think all of these are devices of colonial strategies of, really drawing the map, the borders of a place or a practice. And in that sense, what this act of tracing really means, especially in the context of what we call Asia. And I think this theme runs throughout this volume, both in how Peter Eckersoll's comments have featured in it, from Chen Kuang Singh's provocation of Asia as a method rather than a geography. And I think that this is a really important thing which has been discussed by ADN starting from 2017, when the first discussions, at least the first public discussions of dramaturgy in Asia were taking place. And so my response is to take forward some of those conversations would be to really ask, how do we trace Asia, right? Does Asia exist outside of Europe? Or can Asia exist without Europe? And I would like to quote Qadri Ismail, who's a theorist who's written about this. And he says, and I quote, "The trouble with dead white men is that some are not men, many are not white, and an alarming number not even dead." Right? So this idea of what Asia is constantly being reconstructed, not just by dead white men, but by living practices and a lot of that which we embed our lives and theater within, right? And so it does not require one to really stand in the city of Istanbul on the Bosphorus Bridge, looking at the Asian and the European side to really say how this has been structured. There are literal metaphors of this all across Asia, and of course, metaphorical questions that we can ask about the existence of Asia outside of Europe. And so how do we leave Europe? It's ironic for me to ask this question because, of course, the Brits have decided the worst way to leave Europe, which is Brexit, which not only leads to petrol and visa problems, but a whole host of other issues, including racist backlash. But how do we really think of Asia as a method rather than a geography that has been defined for us? And I think this is a very important intervention by this volume. And just to end my comments on this particular aspect, I would like to quote Edward Said, of course, who has really brought out the critique of Orientalism, in which he says, "Just as none of us is outside or beyond geography, none of us is completely free from the struggle over geography. That struggle is complex and interesting because it's not only about soldiers and cannons, but also about ideas, about forms, about images and imaginings." And so how do we imagine ourselves outside of the constructs that are handed down to us and the constructs that we create or that we are implicitly embedded within? I think this is one of the main provocations that I took from this volume, and I thank everyone who contributed to it for having enabled me to push my thinking on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Gee. Thank you with your provocation. Two things came immediately in my mind. One was talking about that space. I think so much of we hear about how the director would need to create a rehearsal space that allows things to happen. But how does dramaturg, if you work within a space, how do you also create a space such that such criticality and reflexivity can happen? And I think that's something that probably a lot of time dramaturgs are the last being asked. How do you want this space to be like? A lot of time it's usually the director deciding what the space is going to be like. Of course, if the director is a dramaturg, then the director will probably need to think about how to do this. So that's the first question. Secondly was interesting on Chen Kuang Singh, who talks about this idea of Asia as a method. I was also thinking about the word Asia in Chinese, the ideogram Chinese, Ya Zhou. That Ya is a very strange word because it actually means second to things. It means second to many things. So when you are the runner-up, you're called Ya Jun. So Ya Zhou, which means Asia, apparently in that context already put us second to many things. And it's a mindset. And as you say, can we reimagine, can we reclaim, can we recontextualize this, the way we understand who we are? And then going back to Helly, question that the conversation that you have with Peter, and it's also a question of if you don't talk about it, you probably will never appear and you will never exist. That we become invisible. Asia becomes invisible also in that sense. Yep. With that, maybe we should turn our attention to Janice and hear her sharing. Janice, over to you.
Thank you, Heng Leun. Thank you for having me here. And yeah, like the other two speakers, I congratulate the editorial team and all the friends that has contributed to this second volume of the ADN review. And I have to tell you that the 2020 remix of Heal the World has become my theme song recently. Ever since I revisited the review, and I just can't let go of the song, you know, in my mind. And to share my resignation on the review, I would like to share 2 points. One is from the editorial note that our young Daniel has mentioned, which give me a lot of hope. He mentioned about how much the word dramaturgy was Googled or searched in recent years, and it seems that dramaturgical thinking is synonymous with possessing a critical lens, and then which results in a betterment of the world through a deep examination of its structures and relations via an aesthetic frame. I have to tell you, this is very important. This is a very important observation that gives us, or give me, hope and optimism to continue in making theatre and making art, especially with reference to the recent situation from where I'm from. And like one of the most frequently asked questions from my students and my friends is, does theatre has a future when the world is in such a mess, full of unreasoning and full of chaos? And also in view of the huge number of people leaving my city, and do I still have a place in theatre making when I leave my home city or my hometown? But thanks, Daniel, your observation is not bounded by geographical locations and territories, as Gee has pointed out, in terms of the struggle of geography. And it gives us some motivation to continue making theatre and making arts for the betterment of the world. And this is one resignation that I would like to share. And the second one is from the keynote speech of Janice Poon. I hope I have pronounced your name correct. Janet mentioned about context, and I found it especially relevant and important in the role of dramaturgs in Asia in recent years, especially in view of the pandemic and all happened in the recent 2 years. Especially during the pandemic, a lot of things has changed, and in terms of the context, especially, like when you talk about technology, or when you talk about Zoom, say for example, now we are having a conference on Zoom, but before the pandemic, we seldom thought about using Zoom as frequently as such. In the last year, we do online teaching on Zoom or you know, other video conferencing device. We make theater on Zoom, and now we are talking about doing business and, you know, other kinds or you know, numerous forms of connections through these kind of video conferencing platform. And there are a lot of other devices or platforms that's invented or recreated for the purpose of making theatre online. And so these kind of contexts, when we talk about video conferencing tools or platforms in the digital world, we have a very new notion and new perception of what it means by public and what it means by private, what it means by the spoken and the unspoken, and the embodiment of verbal and non-verbal, you know, etc. So I think Janice's keynote speech for me at this point of time has a new meaning in terms of the context of what we have all experienced in the past year. And I think I would share until now, and then we can continue our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Janice. When I hear you talk about that part about when your students ask you, you know, does theatre have a future? And I also hear you asking whether in the same review you did mentioned about how you have asked yourself, how do you dramaturg your students in the process. Then I'm also reminded that education is part of the dramaturgical process. And at the same time, in the putting up of a production from the actual creative work to negotiating with state actors in how the work are being staged. And if I think in one of the article in the review where we see how, for example, Alfian was managing all these things within the creative world, but at the same time, also negotiating with the state actors. I'm afraid this is where the dramaturgy is already, not just about the work itself, but how it gets done, how the company would do it, how the organization will do it, and how the society actually respond to it. And I think in a way, this kind of dramaturgical process, is it a way whereby we learn to be critical, and then that maybe would provide us a lot of hope? I think we should, can I ask if our three friends have any question to ask of each other, and then from there maybe I will go to the Q&A. Any questions that you would want to ask of each other?
Yeah, just to respond to, sorry, Helly, please go ahead.
No, you first.
Okay,
Yeah.
just to respond to what Janice said, because it's still fresh in my memory about how, since times are changing and the way people relate to art and to each other is changing, how technology will play a huge role in how we actually get our performances across. I think that's a very important question. And I, for one, I think I would definitely miss even, how the audience coughs and clears their throat right before the curtains go up, and you can hear only that in the audience. Everything else is silent. And of course, we all have romantic notions about how performances should be done and viewed. And so I was just wondering about your thoughts about how technology would change some of the ways in which we perform and how that performance is received.
Thank you. Well, actually, during the pandemic, I have directed an online theater performance with my students. Originally, it should be staged in the theater, but of course, the school has closed and theater were closed, and my students were quite losing hope, as you can imagine. And we don't know what to do. But honestly, as a teacher at that time, I don't think I can stop there. I have to motivate and encourage them to move on, And so I directed the online theater with them, and so rehearse in front of the camera, like us. And we did a 1 week performance of Pornography by Simon Stephens. So I staged one scene per night. And so it's like a Netflix series that you can watch in the course of a week's time. During the pandemic, we all watched Netflix, right? And I think with that experience, it informs me a lot about digital performance. Like we all talk about art and technology now, and of course our government and basically the whole world is exploring this kind of mediatized theater performance nowadays. And for me, I still remember that when I first started directing that performance, there were a lot of friends. When I did the like a global discussion, I invited theater makers and teachers in universities to participate in a global discussion, and we talk about performing online. And I still remember many of them like strongly against it and feel like that is not theater. And some of the teachers even mentioned that they are afraid to allow their students or let their students to perform like in digital medium, because they're afraid that it will give them a wrong perception of what acting is. So these are some of the views that I received like almost a year ago. But I think things are changing, and the exploration of these digital medium is changing as well. And for me, if we are doing online theater or using any digital platform, we have to take it as the theatre stage. We have to consider the specificity of these kind of medium and platform and how we stage it, how we perform it in front of this little black hole on our computer and our laptop. And of course, there are lots of technical difficulties that we have to solve. Yeah, I think the specificity and the dramaturgy of digital platform is one thing that we really have to concern. It's not about it. It's not only live streaming. It's not only that you perform in a theater and then you do a live streaming. I think it's totally different thing. Yeah.
Helly?
I was wondering because Gee, you mentioned about these Asia things, and it's been a conundrum, and it's been a can of worms that that always there. It's been the elephant in the room. Not even the elephant in the room. If you go back to me, one of the momentum that I marked was like 2014. I think just when I came out from a study, and then I start returning to the arts practice, and then all these Asian mega centers and all this Asian laden program came out. So it's I was wondering, what do you take as a filmmaker, as whatever your practice is, all the combination of it, how do you imagine, because you said that, yeah, how do you imagine Asia outside Europe, the Elbe, the root of it, the Assa and Elbe being Europe. So it's because it is already like in Chinese, in Mandarin is there, and the root of it is also the mirror of it. The Assa is the mirror of Elbe. So knowing that, how do you break that? Or how do you imagine?
I really don't think I have the answer to breaking it, because it's still something that I'm struggling with. And to be honest, I think all of us will struggle with forever, because does Asia exist as a self-referential entity? Or this question that a lot of us will get asked if you're living far away from home, where are you from? Where is home? These are very tough questions to ask. And so for me, to think of Asia as a method and not a place, I think is useful, because it detaches a viewpoint, a standpoint, to whose east is Southeast Asia. Where is your standpoint? Where do you look at it from? All the ways in which we have named places like America is just America, but South America is South America, right? And which is why I make the effort to say North America, because it's constantly about who's standing where and looking at things. And so for us to stand within Asia as a method and not a place is to reimagine and to kind of throw out everything that has been learned by us, by our education systems, by what we have been told. And it really requires a fresh perspective and a fresh methodology of thinking about our work and where we stand within those things. So it's a struggle, and I'm afraid I don't have the answers, but it's something that I think all of us will have to grapple with, or are already grappling with as we speak.
Yeah. Because I think...
Yes, Helly.
No, it's just short, because while reading it, I realized that I think reading the second edition, I realized that the national categorization is still there. And I think that's really limiting. And not because I did this Jaktabi with Sonia, but to me, moving myself from Jakarta to Jogja with the intention of decentering myself, a self-dramaturging sabotage or whatever. it's really it worked. I mean, work it means that it's really it's been a learning curve for me to really move my way up, from the center, because I think for example, like last month I still watch like 5 or 6 performances. The first one after the lockdown, and then of course so there are some strategies like we can apply, or my colleagues apply that you know, but I know I could see that it could not take place in Jakarta because of all those various reasons. But there is a niche, you know, so I think it's very dangerous. No, I mean, I try to remind myself not to lump, you know, not even my island context. I start thinking in islands and archipelago now, you know, so as a strategies of, you know, going out from this limiting, limiting construct, I would say. So
Janice, you want to say something?
Yeah, I was about to ask Helly the similar question, but she has answered it quite well. And I just wonder if this moving away from the center, or like your current situation, is it part of the decolonizing process that you're in your trajectory, you know, discovering your artistic practice?
Yeah, because I think Jakarta 2013 onwards, it was not, it stopped being conducive as a creating place. It's more a showing place.
Okay.
Not quite a market. There is such things like a market, performing arts market or otherwise, but it's more like it because it's very hard, you know, without infrastructure for artists to create performances in Jakarta. So it's very expensive, and you know the city is, you know, it's very hard. It's very difficult to navigate yourself within the city. You know, going from one point to another. So that's why I think then you do this mapping. Okay, maybe if you have something to show, then maybe you can show it in Jakarta, but not really conceived there, not really create it there. So yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I think perhaps we should throw the floor out and then let the audience ask. But I think there are quite some important points already being put up, ideas of what do we mean by the Asia method, and then this idea of decentering, but decentering from where? And in fact, you know, afterwards, I would really want Gee to share with us his experience now in UK, which is the previous center. and as someone who is looking into queer dramaturgies and now being in there, what do you see? You know, now they have been decentered, and yet you're in this decentered area and you're looking at it. What are the complexities here? Perhaps afterwards, Gee, you can share with us. And let's see if there's any questions from audience who would want to ask. You could just raise your hand. Can I have the gallery so I can see everyone? Yeah. Anybody who would want to ask a question to our three speakers?
Maybe while people are thinking, I think there's a question directed to Janice asking if there was documentation, I think, of that. I think the piece in which you're staging scenes every night, like a Netflix series. I think that's what the person means.
You mean the discussion or the performance?
I think she asked about the question that she asked about the discussion, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah, I haven't recorded that discussion.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, but like I haven't recorded it, but there is a like a brief transcription from that will be published very soon. So if I got the journal, then maybe I can send you an electronic copy of that brief transcription, or like it's like a reportage of the discussion. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Janice. Marian, I saw your hand also.
Yeah. No, I just want to make a comment that actually I'm quite nervous and brokenhearted about the way arts makers have embraced technology in so many different forms for online performances. Of course, they've had to, but I really worry whether this then is going to be the way forward, that, you know, that we will, because we've done it now for 2 years, that we will feel the need or the urgency, or, you know, even the effectiveness to embrace more and more and more technology, even in, you know, on stage live performances. So it kind of worries me, because I watched quite a bit over the last 1.5 years, and you know, all these online shows, and I must say that most of it was pretty well, not unsuccessful, but less successful for me lah. And there were very few actually that I felt, oh, okay, fine, this works. So yeah, it's just, it's a bit scary lah for me. And I'm very old-fashioned, so, and as I say that, it's such a contradiction, because I myself, in a project that I'm working on now, am using technology. So, you know, it's kind of all a mess. And I just wanted to say that it's, how do other theatre, you know, arts makers feel about this sort of journey? You know, it's like it's a ball that's rolling down a hill, and there's no stopping this ball that's rolling down the hill towards technology and AR and I don't know what not and what else. So thank you.
Thanks, Marian. Anyone want to respond from the speaker first?
I would like to respond, Marian. Honestly speaking, I'm very old-fashioned as well, and I love going to theater and watch live performance. I would say, if I'm not, maybe, I'm not sure, because it just happened that I teach now. If I'm not with my students, I might not be so, I might not take the courage to do or try out digital performance with them last year. And if I'm not with my students, I might not try to do play video games now. It's not part of my life. But thinking about, like, as an educator, what I'm trying to do is to pass on knowledge, and the future is theirs. And I'm just like kind of like a facilitator, if not a dramaturg, trying to walk with them so that they can find out their own artistry, whether it's in a physical theater or whether it's on an online digital platform. And the artistry belongs to them, to their generation. And I have I'll be hands off on them. And I'm quite excited to see what will be come up with for them to use all these new inventions. I'm not saying that is the only future. What I mean is that they need their own artistry. They need their own dramaturgy of future theatre. Yeah, that would be my response. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think technology has been used in performance/art making for many decades now. It's just that, the displacement of the physical bodies on stage by technology, I think that is what is worrying for some people. But I think, like Janice said, these periods of transition are obviously difficult for people who are used to the old ways of experiencing and performing. But I think we might not have a choice in some time to really pick and choose. And I think, technology could, open up certain things which we can't even imagine now. Like, I could probably imagine hologram theater happening in my living room, where, the performance is not on the screen, but actually the actors are holograms in front of me. So who knows what technology will, show for us in the future. And I guess rather than, bemoan the loss of the traditional theater that we are so used to and hold dearly, maybe we should also be a little open to new ways of probably the next generations showing us how new forms can take root from impossible situations. At least I'm trying to be hopeful. I know it's a very dystopian future we are looking at, but we don't have anything else.
So what would be the dramaturgy for the technology of theatre present and future? There has to be a kind of a specific kind of dramaturgy for that.
Thank you.
Sorry,
How
I
many?
just want to quickly jump in,
Yes,
if I can, just to address Marion's question about dramaturgy of technology. Already, I think in the last 2 years, because of the proliferation of technology in performance, there is already a huge interest at the moment with digital dramaturgy. They are actually calling it digital dramaturgy simply by definition I think also to differentiate it from technology, where we are still looking at hardware. So apparently the word digital really does imply the idea of screens, or rather what appears in screens, what appears in the audio recorded through machinery, whether it's visual or audio. And that's why there is a bit of a debate with the word digital rather than technology. And it has become, unfortunately, a hot topic. I think the bigger question for me is, which was flagged up by Nian, this Singaporean dramaturg, who has her own personal issues with looking at what happens when this digital dramaturgy becomes just a passing phase, because we are in a pandemic now, and more so when most funding bodies of any arts council is really pouring money into it. What happens when theaters open up again? Will that then be left behind? And I'm linking that to what Janice is saying about the new generation and their artistry, which then gives us an opportunity to actually share with the new generation actually what I would say novel convention of live theater again. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Hao Nian. Thanks. That was something that I thought I was also going to talk about, where at the moment technology became merely a platform for us to present the work, but it hasn't gone to an effective possibility, or then slowly from effective into a kind of aesthetic possibility. And maybe this digital dramaturgy is something that we need to look at. I had two experiences with doing digital work. One was when I had to also work with students, and if we are not going to do that work, the students are going to be extremely depressed, like Janice. But I had that, it was fortuitous that I could do it hybrid. Most of the students really hated to perform through the screen, but because I was doing it hybrid where there were live audience, so it became a process whereby I worked with the students to mediate the two medium as a performer, and try to dramaturg their own performance according to this two medium. It was really an exercise in the end, rather than, I would say, a successful production. But I also do think that we are now at this period of experimenting, and each one is really a process for us to learn. And the other piece that I was thinking about was, we were then adapting one of our participatory piece into an online piece, whereby how do we talk about it, how do we actually allow participation in a different way that can happen online, rather than being passive spectator when we're watching Netflix or whatever. So I think there are various things that we all could try. But again, I think that would call for another big discussion in terms of the dramaturgy future. And I think both Sean as well as Daniel had some points there, which I think that if you can read it on the chat, that would be really very good. So that, that will help us to think further into this issue. But let us move to the next part of today's discussion. It's been very rich. In fact, we have already talked about some of the challenges that we have in our own practices, but perhaps we take this opportunity to let our speaker then share, their own journey and some of the provocations or some of the questions they have currently in their own practices. Maybe this time we do the reverse way. I'll start with Janice, then Gee, you will be the second again, and then Helly the third. Shall we? Okay, Janice.
Sure. Okay. I'll share two provocations. One is, well, see, my life is all about teaching my students now. And so the first provocation is how to transfer academic and professional knowledge into artistic or creative practice. This provocation is mainly stems from my responsibility at school now, leading both the MFA and BFA major program in dramaturgy, and also my artistic practice in collaboration with multidisciplinary artists, and this provocation is was informed by my current students with an age range from the early 20s to early 60s. And they came from a hugely diversified academic and professional background, which I loved. And for me, the discipline or the study of dramaturgy needs that broad spectrum of knowledge and professional background. And I was inspired by our conversations, not only on their practice as theater artists, but also on their non-art professions. And I keep thinking how these systems of knowledge can be transferred into their own dramaturgical and artistic practices. And as just like what I mentioned, it's about their own artistry and their trajectory in search of their artistic practice. And be it like after they graduate, if they want to be a dramaturg, or if they are an artist in their own rights. And I think that is something that relates to my current practice a lot. And as a teacher, I also thought about how can I teach without teaching. That in echoing my question, how can I still be my students' dramaturg in the process of walking with them in future years. And the second provocation is about artistic collaboration. And actually, I've mentioned part of it in the last sharing. Like whether we're emerging or well-established artists, we possess our critical lens on how we understand the world and our creative process. And in view of the fast-changing society locally in my city or internationally, how do we develop new perspective of human condition, not only in the new normal, but in the future when there might be a paradigm shift, there might be new rules established internationally, and how do we draw the map, or how do we construct a new system of knowledge and even methodologies in our artistic practices. I think not only in digital dramaturgy, but say, for example, the theatricality of performance writing instead of playwriting, the embodiment of the verbal and the non-verbal in contemporary theater. And yeah, as I mentioned, the notion of being public and private. Like us here, I'm in my office. I feel like I'm in a private space, but we are in a public conference on this digital platform. And when I watch a movie at home, as it's supposed to be private, but there are so many live streaming and movies on screen. you allow audience to speak, type your comment, and especially, those in the mainland. And when I saw those messages popping up, and I feel like, I'm in a public space, but I'm in my own room. And so these like new notions of theater making and, artistic practices are some of the provocations that I would like to share here. Thank you.
Thank you, Janice. Shall we go to Gee for your sharing? Thanks,
Thank
Gee.
you. So two things that I wanted to talk about. One is that which relates to archival practice, because I'm very much into archival research at this point. So I just wanted to connect it with some of the things that I also read in Volume 2, where Takao also talks about queer archives. And if you were to broadly think of theater as an archive of feelings, of bodies interacting, of actions and histories, then how do we inform our performance making practices, which are necessarily archival, right? Especially in terms of some of the work that I've done before, the body has been an archive in a lot of my work. And another thing that I noticed about this volume is that not all, but it's mostly the women practitioners and the queer artists who have spoken about the body and placing it front and center in this volume. And I think that's true of a lot of the discussions that we have had as part of ADN as well. And so when does the body become central to the performance, and who foregrounds it when talking about the performance itself? I think that's an important question. And when we look at archives, one sense in which to understand it in the queer sense is to look at the body as an archive. So I've constantly had to narrativize the ways in which my body has gone through various journeys, evidence through scars, evidence through the various things that my bodies have undergone in performance as a journey and as an archive of feelings. Then there is the state and colonial archives, where of course a lot of the mapping and the tracing of the colonial state has happened and people have been written about in a certain way. And then there are community archives also, which I worked with in the 2018 performance at the Kochi Biennale, where letters written from queer people to others, newspaper cuttings that from 80s, which we kind of cut and made collages of, these became community archives. So how do we access these archives? What determines our preoccupation with the body, and how do we narrativize or perform it? I think that's a very important question that I think all of us need to kind of think about. And the temporality of a performance. Like when I go into, say, for example, the Asian Africa Studies archive at the British Library, and when I look through those yellowing pages of handwritten letters written by dead white men to other dead white men in the British colonial service, the time in which it was written, the time that I'm holding in my hands, the way in which I'm accessing it through my own positionality, and the time in which I'm reading it, and then how I reinterpret and stage it for someone else, and how that reader or the audience then reinterprets it to understand it. I think there are multiple levels at which time is folded and understandings and interpretations are folded into each other in all our performance practices. And the second point was really connected to our conversation. I think a very important conversation on technology or digital dramaturgy, as Sonyan has alerted us to, which is a hot topic unknown to, I think, most of the people here, is dramaturgy as not just a relationship that is human-centric, but also includes objects, not in the traditional sense of having a gun, on the stage, which has to be used in the last scene to shoot someone, not in this, in that traditional sense, but how objects relate to each other, how we relate to technology, and how performance is really changing, or has always been a relationship also between objects to each other, objects with other objects, objects to humans. And so can we really think about dramaturgy which in a way that is not centered around the human, like less anthropocentric ways of thinking about dramaturgy? I think that's another provocation that I would like to throw to all of you, especially during such times. Thank you.
Thank you, Gee. And now to Helly.
Yeah, I think because one of the main, even before the notion of dramaturgy, became something the last 5, 6 years. But for me, within my practice is the notion of choreography, which we haven't really unpacked. So I think my question is like, more like a question, maybe not so much a provocation. In this situation, like where is choreography? Like, because maybe, I think 2 weeks ago, Professor Tadashi Uchino shared, like, in a different platform about this Zoom theater as a kind of like a new genre, or, a new term. But within dance, we already have a dance film as a genre for a long time, but it's never really been so institutionalized. You heard like 10, 15 years ago, there was like 1 or 2 or 5 perhaps like dance film, festivals. I think it comes and goes as a practice and as a, as a art form. But then now is when this pandemic happened, I think essentially what the choreographers do is simply, doing this dance film again, awkwardly, because it's with a different awareness. So it's I think it's also a bit amnesia, like because I mean the screen is smaller, it's live streaming, it's an updated medium. It's not like, it's not like dance film as it was known. So it's where is choreography in this new updated medium? And then where is the body? Where is the act of embodiment in this? In this 2-dimensional screen. And because I think it is becoming much more problematic, because dare I say, within the Asian context, we haven't really unpacked the notion, the histories of choreography as a practice, as a form. So it's a double. And then, when the dramaturgy came on board, so it's been always my problem, how, because we know that dramaturgy has been always there. You name it or not, you name it as such or not, dramaturgy has been always in the process of choreography. But then again, if you haven't really, look closely into the specific experience of choreography making within your own context, then how you deal with this layering in terms of like artistic practice. I think I will stop there.
Thank you, Helly. Can I invite also speaker to ask each other on, after you hear the provocations or the questions that each has? So we have areas on pedagogy, we have areas on technology in future. We also have this tension between, while new dramaturgy are evolving, we are still trying to make sense of our present dramaturgy. And this tension, as history comes, this tensions of time, how do we manage that? Yeah. And as dramaturg, we historicize things also in the process, right? So that we make sense of what is happening in the present in order to talk about the future. How do we put all these things together?
Because I think my problem is very connected to you, Gee, because it's archiving, maybe not really parallel, but maybe not really connected in a very direct way. But archiving has been a problem as well in dance. How can you read choreography? How how can you start reading choreography if there is no archive? And if there's more archive in NYPL about Indonesian dance choreography in early days than here. So it's really it's also one of my my headache, to where do we start? Like, then you of course you start with the embodied archive, meaning that the practitioners, the artists who are still alive and maybe not really not active anymore, but at least they're still there. But it's not a question, but it's also like it's an acknowledgement that I acknowledge it's also a problem it's also my problem to to deal with in my daily practice.
And of course, the temporality of actually performances.
Precisely.
No archive is precise and perfect. And what is absent in the archive, how can it be notated, such that in a way that opens discussion? And I think that has always been one of the challenge of live performances. And then what is interesting, because when you're talking about choreography just now, then we never for every productions that we see, even on a Zoom, there is other choreography that's happening there. The camera, how the camera moves, that's another choreography. Those are never notated. And the way the camera moves are part of an engagement with an audience, because it's taken certain perspective. And how do we actually also put that and create a kind of assemblage of what archival means? And
even a young Indonesian choreographer, Densil Lebang, when she was given the commission, when she finally won one of these commissions of making this dance on screen, and she made quite a remark saying that what she learned from this process, she said that she realized that the camera is another body. So it's so it's not even only an eye, but it's already like another body to
and if the camera is managed is controlled by another, handled by another person, that's another body behind the camera. Yes.
I would like to respond to the temporality of performance. Yes. I'm not sure if any of you like in the audience or any speakers have this experience. After the lockdown situation that we have experienced in the last year, when the theater reopens, and then you sit in the theater space and then you watch a performance. I still remember the first time when I watched, like the very first performance I watched in the theater after the lockdown situation. I found the performance very, very long.
Very
long.
Very long, okay.
Yes, it's longer than I expected, but when I look at the watch, it's actually about an hour. And the feeling, like the physical body's feeling and the uneasiness that I have to sit on the seat for an hour, compared with the lockdown situation where I'm locked down in my home or my flat, which is of course very, very like much smaller than a theater space. You know the tiny environment that we are living in. But during the watching experience or the sharing experience with the performer and as an audience, when you're at home, even though you're locked down in that tiny space, you can stop, you can leave the screen and nobody stops you, and then you can have a Coke or have some drink and even eat. But then when I have to be so concentrated in the theater space to share the live performance on stage, like all of a sudden I feel like, oh, this is so long. The time became so long, and it also requires me and takes me more attention and focus on what's happening on stage. And I remember that experience very, very vividly. I'm not sure if any of you have that experience. Of course, like when time moves on, and of course now I went to theater, I might not have that strong feeling of the difference in time and space that I felt when I had my first theater experience after the lockdown situation. Yeah.
Janice, can I check with you? Was it a full house audience or it was a reduced audience?
It's a reduced audience. It's in a grand theater. It's a dance performance. And by reduced audience, it's from what I saw, there are around 75% audience in the house. Yeah.
But are you implying that your body has been conditioned throughout the lockdown? So condition meaning that, you know, the way you carry your life, daily life, and also the way you watch, you have a new habit of watching performance only online, and then all of a sudden this is like the first time, or something else.
It's both ways. What you mentioned is true, but on the other hand, ironically, when I'm in the lockdown situation, if I'm watching a performance online, or through these digital platforms, I can pause, I can leave, I can have a drink, and that interrupts the temporal experience of me with the performance in the digital platform. But in a theater space, of course, we know that we were sitting there, there isn't anything that we can do, or I cannot leave my seat. And so the whole sense of time and space changed after the lockdown situation. So it's both ways. Yeah.
Also, the rules of etiquette, or what is allowed in a theater space. I think the most traditional theater spaces have always thought of this endeavor as something akin to sacred, where you are allowed to do certain things, not allowed to do certain things. And so we are all bound by those etiquette. And maybe the technological interventions or the directions in which it's going is making it more profane. And maybe that's one of our anxieties about this kind of intervention. So there are a lot of things happening there. And I also agree with your comment about the camera. And it relates to the thing that I was trying to articulate about non-human interventions in terms of dramaturgy. And so even if a camera person is operating the camera as an object, is showing us a particular view, is intervening in the dramaturgical process in certain ways. And, the output is very different from if you were to just think of the camera as a device that is controlled by a human. And so I think we need to start thinking, at least we're being forced to think of objects in a different way. And the other comment about the silences in the archives, and I think in Volume 2, there was a particular place in which the reader was invited to fill in the silence. And I had a knee-jerk reaction against that, because I think there is a particular power to letting the silence remain as a silence, and to actually listen to what that silence is telling me. For example, if I'm looking for a particular thing and I trace it within the archive, the 14 kilometers of archives they have on the subcontinent in Britain, if I trace it and then finally the file tells me it's a D, the letter D, and that means it's destroyed, it says something about why that particular thing has been destroyed, or it gives me a certain idea about the circumstances of the archiving process and why this particular record is not there. So the silence is telling us something very important, and I would urge you not to fill the silence, but to sit with it.
I think I want to go back to Daniel, who put this comment on. I think we might need to explore what exactly we mean by technology and how this seems to threaten a certain idea of theater or performance art. I think it's not more than, I think it's not just about threatening, but it actually changes also how performing art can be perceived and what is that watching experience that we're talking about. And I think you know, on internet, sometimes silences are not allowed because it's just too loud, that silence, right? And people would then be distracted to do other things. But in a communal experience, when the silence is being placed there, you somehow have to embrace it and embody it in some way, to your reluctance. But then it was a kind of experience that you had to go through. And how do we actually manage that in future performances if we are also doing it through technology? And I think these are actually some of the big questions that we can actually continue to explore in future on the dramaturgy of digital and performance. Perhaps we should open the floor to audience for questions. There are 7 new messages. Let me see.
I saw in the chats it mentioned the work 14 that Sean was dramaturg for, and I think Charlene was one of the commentators of this performance. Am I correct? Because I watched part of it and I found it fascinating. Or if Charlene, you would like to share your experience being one of the commentators in that work.
Yeah, you're right, Janice. But I'm gonna ask Sean if he's able to speak because he was dramaturg, so he was much more heavily involved and has a better sense of it. Sean, are you traveling or are you able to speak to us, Sean? Are you there?
Yeah, I am.
Okay, please, over to you, Sean.
Great, thanks.
Sorry, what was the question about? Just to speak about the experience.
About 14.
Yeah, I guess there were a number of interesting. I guess it was very ambitious, and the way, I mean, the question of what is a dramaturg within that production itself was an interesting question, right? Because there wasn't just one dramaturg, but there were 5, one for each of the satellite countries that were involved. So, and then with Horse Theatre being the kind of lead artist on the project. So even on a kind of structural level, like the relationship of a dramaturg or the expectation of a dramaturg was already, I don't think it was something that we fully resolved either, to be honest. I think we're still kind of exploring or in the process of discovering, right, what that actually means. But the other part of the challenge was to think about. Actually, I remember one of the most interesting conversations that emerged about that was the question of how do we make it not become a film, right? How can we not make it become another dance film? How do we resist the language of the cuts, right? Which we're so familiar when we watch a film, and the cuts that maybe disturb the integrity of a live experience, right? And so I think I remember that emerged as a conversation. So as much as part of the promise of the project is to think about how the digital platform might transform the live, I think the other part to that question was also how does the live performance force us to unlearn certain kind of relationships that we have with film, right, or with a visual media of film. And I think another interesting question, I mean, there were many interesting questions, but the other interesting question that emerged was, does the nature of the dance, is the dance primarily a visual form or an oral form, right, when it is packaged as a kind of film media? I mean, that became an interesting question that we had to practically negotiate when we talked about how then the role of the commentator kind of accompanies that work. Sorry, this must be very disorienting for those of you who haven't actually watched 14, and it's not an easy production to kind of summarize, but yeah, I think that's,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sean. Mm-hmm. We can have another 5 more minutes or 10 minutes for our Q&A. Anybody who have any questions for our speakers?
I think this idea about historicizing what is being done and historicizing what has been done in relation to the issues of archiving as well as understanding practice, right? I mean, the genealogies of practice, whether we like it or not, inform what we do, and then the genealogies of context and the genealogies of notions of art. And I guess I'm after listening to this discussion, I certainly am prodded to think about the genealogies of technology. I mean, technology is not new. So not just what is technology, but what we think of as technology and how that interface either loosens us up or stiffens us. So I speak from experience. So certain things really make me I stiffen up. And then if there's a facilitator and there's someone to kind of ease it, which literally Sean did for me in this recent work where I was a commentator, and I was initially stiffened up, and then there's a kind of easing up. But there's also, I think, a danger of then taking it for granted, which is where I hear the concerns about how it becomes then normative, takes on a kind of dominance and hegemony and overwhelms without us realizing it. And my concerns or questions of how then to be provocateur with the non-human, with the material, when we haven't really learned how to listen to it, I guess. Yeah. And therefore, yeah, it's not really a question of comment, but it's responses to what you're saying to ask really what are some of the things we need to perhaps start doing a little bit more consciously in order to take it on.
Any response from the speakers to Charlene's questions or comments?
Not specifically a response, but to also echo what Charlene just said, and to say that the pandemic has strangely made people suddenly hyper aware about technology. I mean, we've been surrounded by technology for a long, long time now. And I was going by train the other day, and there was a scrolling writing that said, please take care of your belongings. There is cameras on this train for your own safety. So how it is couched as for your own safety. I mean, we are surrounded by this stuff, and it's happened a long time back. And so I think what the pandemic really offers us is the possibility of being aware for the first time that we are in fact surrounded by technology, that we are in fact building relationships mediated by technology, that we are performing through technological devices. And so I think we must use this as a positive, opportunity for us to think more deeply about objects and technology and digital medium, rather than, have a knee-jerk reaction and wait for the good old times when we can do away with all of this and just be bare bodies, performing for each other. I think that's a myth that has not existed for a very, very long time. So yeah, I think it's an opportunity for us to think through these things.
The idea of play, spontaneity, the idea which Hao Nian talked about as a dramaturg, you wing things, you playfully put things together. But of course, winging it, not just try to make something up, but winging because of some deep knowledge that you may have on the thing becomes important. Yet at the same time, if we are so embedded in that process of change, I again pose the question is, how do we not be too hurried to notate such change or even judge such change? I think that's where how a dramaturg has to constantly be in that flux of change, yet be able to appreciate the impact of it, but not judging it and not even like making conclusive statement about it. How do we actually keep that kind of objectivity, yet having to be subjectively, carefully, appreciating it? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes.
I'm more interested in resisting.
Yeah.
Resisting by exploring other spaces, like then, because I don't want to lose this three-dimensional thing, and then I don't want to get used to with this new normal. There's not to me, there is no new normal. I mean, my body is my body, and then, you know, it's complex, and it's there, and then it's material, thing, and much more. So I think if we have, I don't know, I'm more interested in exploring new spaces, like, you know, or even if it's you know, our idea of stage or staging, or like I mean, last month I saw this one way of doing it, like, you know, during art job, when the way they built the stage, you know, to accommodate this social distancing and everything. So they created a very different stage than before, for example, to accommodate that. And then also the discussion still took place, and not inside but outside. But I don't know, maybe this is a very local context, but I challenge that, because we're in Asia. Most of us, you know, live in a warm climate. Only, you know, small parts of us, you know, have to experience winter. So I think, I'm more interested in exploring these possibilities than, you know. And when it comes to technology, instead of like getting used to whatever you know, jargon we're using, but how we kind of like hack and subvert it. It's not instead of getting used to it and then accepting as the new normal. But it's just me. Which is like also old-fashioned in a way.
Marion?
Yeah, I'm with Helly. Maybe it's a dancer thing, you know. Maybe it's a body thing. Yeah, I'm with Helly. We shall resist and subvert.
I have to say that, you know, when Janice was describing that, you know, when you watch a digital performance, you can stop halfway and you can go for a drink. Yet, you know, then I was thinking that, you know, in the previous performances, ritualistic performances in the earlier time, people come and go. People take a drink, take a pause, you know, where theater is not so sanctified and so scary, whereby, you know, you have to wear proper in order to be there. Maybe there's a return to that, and that's part of that resistance. And I think the idea of the dramaturg is not to find one only way to handle or to deal with our current situation. Hope cannot be reliant on only one option. And if the only option is technology, then I feel it's very hopeless. But I think that hope is really reliant on many possibilities, whether it's resistance, hacking, subverting, accepting, but we are really looking at all the various possibilities and I'm just reminding myself in Singapore, because we've been constantly being told that, okay, the way to go is technological, digital. But then we also have to tell ourselves, no, that's not the only way. There are still many other ways. And probably this dramaturgy of possibilities is something that we need to actually be constantly thinking about. And maybe with that, I should then ask maybe our three speakers to have a concluding statement or a concluding question. That's ironic, right? For us to take for tonight, and then we'll hand the time back to Center 42. Janice, do you have a concluding question, or even Helly, or even Gee? Yes.
Well, thank you so much. I don't think I can sleep tonight with all these questions and provocations, and really thankful. And I totally agree, Heng Leun. Technology is not the only answer. It is just one of the explorations that like in our future generations that we can explore the possibility. And I believe that there are so many possibilities that we haven't really invested in, like in terms of space and time and the medium that we use for making theater. And so that if we really have to conclude, that might be one of the things that I would like to focus on in the future, whether in our own practice or when we pass on knowledge or whatever. And that is the exploration of new medium and the new dramaturgy, you know, in the future for our future generation. Yeah.
Helly?
I just want to repeat, like, you know, subvert, hack, resist.
And Gee?
Yeah, just to say thanks for having me, and to also say that if dramaturgy is the act of provoking, of unsettling, of redrawing the familiar to make it strange, and it's an anxiety-inducing process, then I think this panel has been very successful at doing all of those things. And thanks a lot for coming and being part of the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Gee. And then Hao Nian wants to say something.
Yeah, I just want to quickly say that it's amazing how the conversation has really progressed a lot in what we discussed in ADN symposiums and previous meetings that have then sort of been reconsolidated in the E-zine. But just listening to the ideas that are coming out, the buzzwords for me like mess, complications, you know, I mean, that was for me one of the catalysts to want to actually start ADN. I think a few of us recognize, especially my immediate co-directors, Charlene and Robin, we recognize that dramaturgy today is complicated. It is intersections of so many kinds of disciplines that there must be a way to look at performance that is just beyond, say, a script or a performance text even. And how do you weave it all together? That becomes a personal thing with different dramaturgs. But more importantly, it is because of this mess, this complication, that allows us dramaturgs to play actually, right? Going back to what I said about winging it, it's more than that. It is about playing from very informed and experienced platform. But this intervention, subversion, is definitely part of the dramaturg's agenda, right? So with the rise or with the advent of digital dramaturgy, I think there will be many of our dramaturg friends who are looking at ways also to disrupt, to interrupt, to intervene, and of course to intersect with live performances when we inevitably will open up. The theaters will open up for sure. So that's the next step. How do we intersect? How do we overlap the digital with the corporeal, the virtual with the real bodies? I think on that note, Heng Leun, we should say good night and thank you again. Please let me thank Heng Leun, Gee, Helly, and Janice for being a part of this amazing discussion. I am in Australia at 11. It's past midnight. It's actually 12:22. I thought I'd be very sleepy, but I'm not. I'm actually, yeah, like Janice, a bit buzzed and not sure what to do now because I can't go into the bedroom. My mind is abuzz. Thank you so much. I think at the moment, I'm going to quickly hand it back to Yan Ling from Center 42 to help us do a wrap up if there's any.
Thank you. I just want to say thanks on behalf of the Center 42 team, who's the host for tonight's session, to thank all the speakers here today, as well as the editorial team for the hard work behind the E-zine. Thank you for leaving us so much really great, nuggets and food for thought for the rest of the night. I think the editorial team has a lot to digest as they continue to dramaturg the remainder of the series. I guess with that, do look out for the third installation, the third volume of the E-zine series, hoping to release it end of November. And then there will be a third or maybe more panels that will come from there as we continue to deepen the discussion on dramaturgy.